A very good evening to all of you. On behalf of India International Center, I extend a warm welcome to all the distinguished speakers on the dais and to all of you who have joined us this evening for this book discussion program. Today's book being discussed is Between Hope and Despair, 100 Ethical Reflections on Contemporary India, authored by Rajeev Bhargava. To discuss the book, we are joined by a very distinguished panel of speakers. We have with us Professor Romila Thapar, Professor Emerita, JNU, Justice Madan Lokur, former Judge Supreme Court of India, Shri Javed Akhtar, poet, lyricist and author, Shri Sudheendra Kulkarni, socio-political activist and author, Ms. Seema Chishti, senior journalist and author who is going to moderate this session, Professor Rajeev Bhargava, the architect of the book, who's been professor, former director CSDS, and of course the author of the book. Before I hand over the baton to Seema, let me request all the panelists on the dais to hold the book for the photo shoot. Seema, who is going to moderate the session, few lines about her. Of course, she's a very well-known face. Seema Chishti, a well-known Indian journalist, writer, editor, content creator, and entrepreneur. She's worked as a journalist and editor for a number of well-known news organizations, including the BBC, the Indian Express, the Caravan, the Hindu, and others. With this brief introduction, I request Seema to take the session forward. Over to you.
Thank you so much. So actually, I have the business of introducing people here who actually need no introduction, and I'm the only one who does. But as she said, I'm a hack, I'm a journalist. That's me, Seema Chishti. And it's a pleasure, and it gives me a great, it's a matter of great delight and happiness to be here to discuss Rajeev Bhargava's Between Hope and Despair, very tantalizingly sort of titled. He's kind of left us between two wonderful and mystifying things, both hope and despair. So, so good to have you, Professor Thapar, and Justice Madan Lokur, retired judge of the Supreme Court, one of our most unrelenting voices today on rights, probity, constitutional values. Romila, of course, is one of India's finest and best regarded historians and public intellectuals of all time. Javed Akhtar, poet, lyricist, writer, one of our most eloquent, popular and candid voices. And Sudheendra Kulkarni, political and social activist and independent voice who does not hesitate to call out things and says it exactly as he sees it. And of course, the author, my friend, Professor Rajeev Bhargava, political philosopher, academic, scholar, a man with a conscience, never hesitated to stand with what was right. And over the years, I've seen that. You could have disappeared into libraries and theory, but he was always a fine scholar and much more. So it gives me great pleasure, and it fills me with great fear to also try and immoderate this discussion with this wonderful panel. But I think before we dive deep into the book, may I request the Right Honourable Krishan Chopra of Bloomsbury to tell us something about how this got published, if Krishan is around.
So I've been warned it should be only 2 minutes, and I'm normally 1.5, so it's okay. Friends, distinguished guests, panelists, it is indeed an honor, and I mean this, it's not for the sake of an event. It is indeed an honor to welcome you on behalf of Bloomsbury, India, to this event, to launch and also discuss a book that we are very proud to publish. As publishers and editors, it's an obvious thing, but it gets forgotten. It's a good book that makes the world go round for us. And it's always a great pleasure to have something that does stand out and contribute something. And I can say with all honesty and without any levity at all, so I won't, you have that phrase, love at first sight. So, so for publishers, it is publish at first sight. You see the proposal and in-house, I think people will could tell about that insistence that I had. As those who follow me on social media, what little I do over there, would have seen that I did say early on last year itself, before the book was out, that this is going to be the most important book. It wasn't one of the most important book of the year. And I think I stand by it, and I've seen that corroborated. So I'm very happy, of course, to see something that I said being vindicated. The reasons are obvious, but I would add one thing. A lot of arguments, etc., are settled with some clear, pithy arguments, etc., whatever. But one of the things that does delight in this is, along with the clarity, there is also nuance. And I think that is very important, to be able to carry people with you in an argument. There are many points to ponder in the book. I think I've exceeded 2 minutes, so I'll just save you and go on to the main thing. But one of the points that he made did strike me, and it's one of many points over there. It is about how we have forgotten to make value judgments. And when the question of a value judgment does come in, somewhere along the way, somebody put it very nicely, a colleague of mine, I wasn't quite familiar with the word really. She said it's called whataboutery. So basically, when an argument does come in, the thing is, it's subjective. It can be depending on people, or even say, if we are talking in terms of the Constitution, that it is the way it is because that is how the people in power thought. And that is not the case really. It is the way it is because that is what seemed to be right. But if we forget to make this value judgment, and then where does the argument end really? There is no solution if there is no solution by dialogue. It's a very nice point, but there are very many others. I would strongly recommend the book. So not just a sales pitch, it is a very useful book. Do read it, gift it, discuss it, recommend it. And I will give one other reason, and then I'm wrapping up. Essays as a genre in Indian publishing are not that big, in the sense you have a lot of books in the American publishing, etc., which go on to #1 in the bestseller list, even New York Times, etc. There are a few books published, definitely off and on, but a book of essays making it to the top 100, so I was like pretty delighted to see. And definitely I would like to see this book among the top 100. I'm not going and saying top 10 or whatever even, but it is a self-help book in a way, and in fact in the most important way, because it clarifies your thinking. And there are a lot of self-help books which are telling you do this, do that, this is how you sort your life. And they, somebody, if he does a count, out of the top 100 in Amazon, 50 of the books are self-help books. I don't know how much they are helping people, but I'll leave it to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Krishnan. I think that's like a lovely thing that you said, that it's a self-help book perhaps for India. And of course, Rajeev starts on a big high. The first sentence of the introduction is, India's collective ethical identity is under duress. And I don't think anybody present here would disagree with that. So Rajeev, sort of, why don't you briefly tell us about the book, and then we'll start talking about what's inside. So between hope and despair, I mean, did you choose the same font for hope and despair? How did you decide that hope comes before despair? These two are like really deeply contrasting thoughts, ideas, and emotions that we all experience. So over to you.
Thanks to that question. I think when I was writing the book, I think despair was much bigger. But when the publisher came with the cover, they made hope much bigger. And I went to one of my very close friends, who was also in a sense, a mentor. And he said, don't these make hope less, otherwise the book will not go anywhere. People don't want to see despair. People want to see hope. And so hope is a little bigger than despair, only marginally. Yeah, and I think that really captures my only sense right now, as well as when I finished compiling this book. So, friends, this is my first really non-academic book. I've written lots and lots of academic books, which are dense and which are argumentative and a lot of people have come back and told me that they've understood each sentence of the whole paragraph. It's just got one of them. So I've also written a book for students, which has been pretty well appreciated. But this is my first book for a general reader, for the educated reader in English, and I'm happy to inform you that it will also be soon available in Hindi and hopefully in other languages. So briefly, what is it that drove me to write this book? I thought that I was told by my daughters actually, that there is a massive conceptual muddle all around, and the complexity of terms, but the meanings are all over the place, and whereas the meanings of many terms are distorted, and that is vitiating the public discourse, and that making it possible for people to understand one another, and we need something on a weekly, daily or weekly or monthly basis to reminding us what these terms stand for. And we also note that the original meaning of many of the terms, those have been distorted. I mean, democracy, secularism, nationalism, freedom, justice, equality. These are terms whose purpose, which gives them their point and their meaning, that their purpose is completely changed, and we don't recognize them for what they once stood for. And so that was one underlying motivation. Other is what Krishna mentioned, that is a sense that there is ethical, in the broadest possible sense of the term, including the moral, which is a subset of the ethical. There is a directionlessness. We have lost a sense of the very distinction between right and wrong, good and bad. We do have a conception of the good, but it's a very poor conception. I mean, we are meant as the evaluators, as both language elements, as a collaborative. We're supposed to not just have desires, but we reflect on our desires, and we distinguish which are worthy, which are not, and among only worthy ones, we are supposed to identify which ones are more worthy than others before we arrive at some kind of a judgment on how to lead our life, both as individuals and as members of communities, members of our nation. And if we lose that sense of discernment between the good and the bad, right and wrong, then we don't know what our religion is, and we lose that moral framework. And that's exactly one of the reasons why I thought that maybe, I can't say that I've thought all my life, so I could be a student and start with teaching, but that, as Christian again points out, that's not my job. But it used to lay on the table, what exactly, how to make those judgments. And that is why I thought it's very important to put people to making value that there is, on the one hand, in a public discourse, a feeling that all values are subjective. What is good for me is bad for you. What is bad for you is good for me, and it's power and economic interests that are really going to decide which values will prevail and which will be marginalized. I obviously don't believe in that. I think there is a way in which we can determine what is right and wrong, and what is good and bad. I don't believe in that is subjectivism, but more but I think that we are leading a very poor conception of the good life. But more importantly, we are pursuing that conception without any regard for others. So even if we have a very rich idea of how to lead a good life, I don't think we should pursue it by not just disregarding others, which is bad enough, but by actually actively violating others. And there is, since at least 1991, we can go into the reasons for this. Why I chose this period. We refer back to 1979, another very important phase in the global world. I think since then, there is a massive increase in what we might call individual and collective egoism. And the ethical space has shrunk, and our ethical space ourselves have also shrunk very badly. There is a line from Javed, one of his poems, मेरा दिल तो इतना बड़ा है, इंसान का दिल तंग है क्यों? And he is an atheist, so when he says Tera, it wouldn't be, the Almighty, although it's meant to be written like that, but actually
I was paid to write that.
but I think इंसान का दिल technically not रहा है, but अब इतना तंग क्यों है कि इस अपने दायरे से बाहर कुछ सोचता है. So actually, that's what I felt, and I wanted to not get into the total meme of, this political party, that political party. I wanted to just get away from all that, be a little more self-reflective, be a little more self-critical. Both of them are absolutely central, and you can't be reflective without being self-critical. And I thought that's the way, and I think that's the tone that I have in the book. I thought the tone is one of not only being reflective, but also community. And I wrote this book to share these ideas and to help each other collectively think. I'm very happy that Bloomsbury actually supported this project. I'm also very happy that the IIT has given us this wonderful place to work together. I'm very, very pleased that we have a sort of fantastic panel, and most of all, I want to thank on my. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, sorry. Did I say something? Okay. What? I was thanking. But most of all, I have to thank my daughters, my sons-in-law, and my lifelong partner, because they spurred me, along with the editors of The Hindu, where I wrote these pieces. I mean, they kept motivating me and to keep writing till suddenly I've realized that I've written 100, and then I thought I should stop and let it, be a whole book. So thank you very much, all of you. And
Thank you, Rajeev. That was very good to hear. So, spoiler alert, while Rajeev talks about many concepts, ideas and values and things that he discusses, there are collisions with the plumbing of democracy. The system comes in, and there is all of that. So there's a lot of navigation that happens in this book, which makes it so delightful. So I think the best person to start with is Justice Madan Lokur, who's seen the system closely, who's been, literally sort of judging what it's about and all that. So do start, sir, with your reflections on the book and tell us what you thought.
Yeah, thank you, Seema. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Rajeev and Bloomsbury for coming out with this wonderful book. It's a collection of 100 essays, and it's definitely worth a read. I mean, you can't just sit down and read it like any other novel. It's heavy in that sense, but definitely worth a read. I haven't read all of them, let me tell you, but there are many of them which discuss the Constitution and constitutionalism and certain principles of the Constitution, and that is what is really of interest as far as I'm concerned. But I'd like to begin by rereading the introduction, the first sentence of the introduction which Seema had read, which is very important. Rajeev begins by saying that India's collective ethical identity is under duress, right? So this really is the background of the book, but Rajeev begins with the making of the Constitution, the hope and the vision that the Constituent Assembly had when they came out with the Constitution after deliberations of more than a year and a half. And what is it that they wanted? We were getting freedom. Of course, they wanted freedom. We were getting freedom. We had got freedom actually in 47. But what is it that they were looking for? And they spent considerable time discussing, the Constitution, various nuances of the Constitution, constitutionalism as we understand it today. And I would like to, read a small passage from the final speech that was given by Dr. Rajendra Prasad on 26th November 1949, which I think gives out the hope that he and the entire Constituent Assembly had. Dr. Rajendra Prasad said, "If the people who are elected are capable and men of character and integrity, they would be able to make the best even of a defective constitution. If they are lacking in these, the constitution cannot help the country." So that was the hope and the vision that they had. That was the faith that the Constituent Assembly had in the leaders of the future, those who would take us into glory from the day the Constitution comes into force. And from there we have now migrated to a stage where despair seems to be the dominant belief or the dominant theme. Why did that happen? The Constitution actually has something which are called, which in the legal parlance we refer to as silences of the Constitution. There are gaps. You can't have the Constitution as a standard operating procedure for governance. There are ideas, there are values which Rajeev has spoken about. There is something called constitutional morality, which Dr. Ambedkar referred to on more than one occasion. So when you talk about freedom, what exactly do you mean by freedom? When you talk about equality, what exactly do you mean by equality? Rajeev has discussed all this, by the way. When you talk about fraternity, what do you mean by fraternity? What do you mean by liberty? Now, if you look at it from that point of view, the Constitution itself, was a charter which was, I think, far ahead of its time. Liberty, equality and fraternity were there, of course, from the French Revolution. Justice was added, social, economic, political, and we are still struggling with issues of social justice, some of which have been pointed out by Rajeev. Economic justice, we talk about that. Political justice, we talk about that also. That's again part of the gaps in the Constitution or the silences. Today, you will have perhaps read that there was this budget session that was to be called by the Punjab Chief Minister, and the governor just wouldn't call the session. Right now, there's nothing in the Constitution which says that you have to call a session. When the cabinet tells you, you have to call it. That's one of the silences. So the matter had to go to the Supreme Court. So these are things which when we talk about constitutional values, when we talk about constitutional morality, these are the things that come forward. And when Dr. Rajendra Prasad talks about men of character and men of integrity, he had in mind, as I think did the entire Constituent Assembly, including Dr. Ambedkar, who spoke the day before that when you talk about people with character and integrity, you know that you want the Constitution to work. Even if it's a defective Constitution, you know that you want it to work. Why? Because you have that hope, you have that vision, you have marched into freedom after a long freedom struggle, and you want to do something good for the country and for the people of the country. What is good, what is not good, what is right, what is wrong, again discussed by Rajeev in his essays. But ultimately, it's the good of the people that we are talking about. It's the good of the people that the Constitution is talking about, and therefore you have fundamental rights, which you have fundamental freedoms. You have the fundamental freedom of life and personal liberty. You have the freedom of movement. You have the freedom to protest. Rajeev mentions in one of his essays about the farmers' struggle, the freedom to protest. Today, some of those freedoms are gradually, if I may say so, getting lost. Right? Because I think we need, once again, people of character and integrity, people who have hope, people who have vision for the people of India. This is, I think, what the dominant theme was when the Constitution was enacted and brought into force. Now, apart from that, you have a large number of issues. It's not only constitution and constitutionalism that Rajeev has discussed. He's written about many other issues as well. But a few things that I think we need to look at. The role of the governor, of course. We've had problems with the governors in different parts of the country, sitting on bills that have been passed by the legislature. Why should that happen? Not calling a session of the legislature. Why should that happen? Try and imagine, if the President of India does that. Okay, the Prime Minister says that let's have a budget session. And the President says, well, sorry, I'm not going to call a session of Parliament. You do whatever you like. What happens? That's where, the problem arises, and that's where you have the silences, some of which have been pointed out by Rajeev. You have issues about the Speaker of Assembly, right? Anti-defection law. How do you implement the anti-defection law? Again, cases have been sent to the Supreme Court. People have gone to the Supreme Court to say that, listen, please give a direction to the Speaker to decide whether the person is disqualified or not, whether the person is a defector or not. Why should that happen again? Is this a defect in the constitution that Dr. Rajendra Prasad was talking about, or is there a defect in the character and integrity of the people who are managing our constitution? I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves, and that's the value judgment that Rajeev emphasizes from time to time. Then we have issues, again, an issue of despair in the recent past, where the basic structure of the constitution is under challenge. What is the basic structure? The basic structure is we are a democracy, something which, again, Rajeev discusses at length. Are we told that, well, if there is no basic structure, then the constitution can be amended in any manner that Parliament likes? What about our fundamental rights? Can they just be wished away? No right to freedom of speech, no right to freedom of assembly, no right to freedom of movement. These are parts of the basic structure. Can we wish away these rights of the basic structure? If we could. Fortunately, the judgment came in 73, and in 75 what happened. If that judgment hadn't come in 73, 75 would have gone on until today. So again, silences of the constitution and value judgments and constitutional morality. So these are issues which have been raised by Rajeev. Fraternity. Why do we talk about fraternity? Equality, yes. Rights of women, which were perhaps not discussed in the 1940s or even earlier. What about fraternity? That's a part of our preamble. So do we just forget about fraternity and say, well, people of one sect or one religion or one group, you go stay where you like, we'll go where we like? We have forgotten fraternity, and that's one of the aspects of despair which has been pointed out by Rajeev. How do we deal with the diversity that we have? I mean, should we be proud of our diversity, or should we condemn our diversity? Should there be uniformity in everything? Or do we say that, yes, we are a diverse nation, a great nation, and let's rejoice in our diversity? These are issues which are fundamental, really fundamental to our constitution, fundamental to our constitutionalism, and I'm glad Rajeev has pointed them out. I mean, like I said, a large number of his essays are on the constitution and constitutionalism. He's pointed out all these issues which we must discuss and debate. Finally, the one point that Rajeev makes is conversation. There must be conversation. We can't say that, I am imperium in imperio, what I say is right, no discussion, no dissent, no conversation. It can't work. If it works, then we cease to be a democracy. So thank you, Rajeev. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prof. Thank you for sort of injecting system and beautifully straddling between concept and the roadblocks that we now encounter. So I know that Rajeev said that he doesn't want the tutu meme of politics, but I think this is the right time to bring in Sudheendra Kulkarni, who's waded those messy waters, those very important things which constitute the business of political life in India, and he's a thinker and he's an activist, so we'd like his perspective on the very important issues that Rajeev has raised.
Respected Dr. Hamid Ansari ji, Rajeev ji, Seema ji, my distinguished co-panelists, friends. We live in times of despair, that goes without saying, but we also live in time of hope. Just before this program began, we were having chai and Rajeev ji asked me, कुछ उम्मीद कहीं दिखती है? तो मैंने कहा कि उम्मीद ज़रूर दिखती है, आपकी इस किताब में दिखती है। तो बधाई हो राजीव जी for writing a book that doesn't just describe despair but shows the sources of hope. दुनिया उम्मीदों पर ही कायम है। उम्मीद के बिना जिंदगी आगे जा नहीं सकती है, लेकिन उम्मीद एक्शन ओरिएंटेड होना चाहिए। For hope to be meaningful, it has to be action oriented. It should be action inspiring, and it should also be goal oriented. Action should be goal oriented. So what is the goal for action today? The goal, friends, if we want the clouds of despair to be dispelled, the goal has to be change in 2024. If there is no change in 2024, these clouds will become darker and darker. There will be more despair. So let's sink all our other differences, especially political parties, in the non-BJP space. It's time for them to come together and mobilize the people, mobilize the silent majority, and bring about a decisive change in 2024. That is the way to make hope a reality. I said that this book gives a lot of hope. So what are these sources of hope? One is our age-old culture and civilization, which is anchored in the concept of Dhamma or Dharma. There are a few essays in this book that explain Dhamma, both in the Buddhist sense, but also Dharma in the Hindu sense. The second source of hope is our freedom struggle. It's the freedom struggle that gave birth to our constitution, which again has been explained by Rajeev ji in his book. And the constitution, the basis of constitution is constitutional morality. और आज ना कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल मोरालिटी है, ना इंस्टीट्यूशनल मोरालिटी है, ना मोरालिटी ऑफ द ऑफिस ऑफ प्राइम मिनिस्टर है, ना इंडिविजुअल मोरालिटी ऑफ द प्राइम मिनिस्टर है। दो मुसलमान जलाए जाते हैं एंड द कल्प्रिट्स आर नॉट नैब्ड, नॉट प्रोसिक्यूटेड, ओपन कॉल्स आर गिवन फॉर जेनोसाइड. Not one word in Man Ki Baat, which has perhaps crossed a century. The other source of hope is the Gandhian values. In Rajeev ji's book, there is a repeated reference to Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi's thoughts on religion, Mahatma Gandhi's thoughts on secularism, the other source of hope is our democratic system with all its flaws. And of course, last but not the least, it is the innate wisdom of our common people, the common masses, which we intellectuals often disregard and don't care to know about. But there are some essays in this book where Rajeev ji describes his chance encounters and conversations with common people, taxi drivers and others, and how they throw light on burning issues of the day with great hope and wisdom. I must also say that there are two things, Rajeev ji, that I would have liked to see in your book, but are somewhat missing. There is a good deal of discussion on secularism and what has happened to secularism, but there isn't much examination on another preambular principle of the Constitution, and that is socialism. It's very unfortunate, friends, that in India today, there is hardly any discussion, debate, discourse on socialism. Until the beginning of the 90s, socialism, there was a certain national consensus on the commitment to socialism. Even the Bharatiya Janata Party included socialism in its party constitution. But today, no one talks of socialism, as if we have abandoned and it's just waiting to be removed from the constitution if the BJP gets requisite majority. Along with, of course, they want to remove secularism too. But when we talk of hope and despair, we must focus on the steep inequality, growing inequality in India. And socialism has to be socialism of Indian characteristics, something that we have failed to evolve. The other thing that I would have liked to see in your book, Rajeev ji, is some discussion on what accompanied our freedom movement, and that is partition of India. Many problems that we are seeing today in India have their roots in the enormous tragedy that partition was, and the theory of two nations propounded by the Muslim League, which caused partition, of course, in connivance with the British. But today, after 70 years, we are seeing how it's all being played out in a very different way. So what's the way ahead? Again, Rajeev ji's book emphasizes the importance of conversation, the importance of listening, the importance of samvad, dialogue. And let me read out two passages from his book. Listen to criticism. An elected government must listen to what ordinary people say about it, good or bad. It is even more duty-bound to pay heed to public-spirited intellectuals whose entire social role is to assess, evaluate, and criticize those who wield power or have the potential to cause systemic harm to ordinary people. Those who can't stomach dissent or protest are, in Rajeev ji's very powerful words, those who can't stomach dissent or protest are unfit to rule. और हमारे प्रधानमंत्री हैं, कहते हैं कि I invite criticism Criticism is good for us to improve ourselves. But the moment someone criticizes, we know where they are sent. Rajeev ji also writes, good listening is especially needed in times of deep disagreement, when we forget that there are as many views as there are people, and delude ourselves into believing that the world is divided into two, us and them. We believe that only two views exist and the one held by us is correct. This particularly crude form of binary thinking exacerbates conflicts and deepens polarization. Listening helps reveal hidden commonalities that bolster cooperation. It dispels mistaken assumptions. And therefore, friends, in these times of despair, I propose, these are my views, these are not reflected in this book, but I very strongly believe that India needs samvad. India needs dialogue even with our opponents. और इस किताब में एक बहुत अच्छी बात है that there are no enemies in democracy, there are adversaries. मुझे याद है, I worked very closely with Advani ji. The first time Rahul Gandhi met Advani ji at an airport lounge, Advani ji was sitting someplace. Rahul Gandhi entered, and out of respect, he went up to Advani ji and said, Advani ji, you are such an experienced person. I've just entered politics. I would like to know what should be the relationship between our two parties. So Advani ji said that we should regard ourselves as adversaries and not enemies. लोकतंत्र में शत्रु नहीं होते हैं, लोकतंत्र में adversaries होते हैं, and where necessary in national interest we should also cooperate. That is something reflected in this book. So what India needs is samvad, and samvad with whom? Samvad even with those that we disagree with. Now we don't expect today's BJP to engage in this kind of dialogue, but those who want to change, those who want change in 2024 must regard that there are no enemies in India, which means samvad even with the RSS. I'm sure that many people in this hall will not agree with this, but I very firmly believe that there must be samvad, conversation, even with the RSS and the Sangh Parivar. Along with samvad, there should be sangharsh. Where we disagree, we must struggle. But out of samvad and sangharsh, there will be samanvay. And the way of India throughout history has been this kind of samanvay between apparently opposite forces. I'm sure that in the days to come, in the years to come, there is going to be a new national reconciliation in which every legitimate concern of every community, every ideology will be recognized, and there will be a reconciliation, and that kind of reconciliation is the only hope for India, and India is capable of bringing about such reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sudheendra ji. You kind of went from a position of grave despair to samvad and a soaring thing of reconciliation. And I think this is the right time to induct a touch of poetry.
If I may just add one
Please.
point. Friends, I must justify why I say samvad even with our ideological opponents. Justice Lokur mentioned basic structure of the Constitution. Who fought in defense of the basic structure of the Constitution during the emergency? It is people from the erstwhile Jansangh. Please read Advaniji's writings in defense of the basic structure of the Constitution, including most recently, just a month ago in the Indian Express, an excerpt was reproduced from his autobiography in defense of the basic structure of the Constitution. So there are people from the Sangh Parivar, from the BJP, who have defended Constitution, who have sacrificed in defense of the Constitution, who have spoken for secularism, and those seeds are still alive.
Oh, thank you for that intervention too. But I think the point is, even if they didn't, there's the point of the conversation, of the samvad, stays. So Javed Saab, may I invite you to speak? It's the right time.
So do you see, both left and right are helping me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me here, Rajeev. I couldn't agree more with Minral Pandey when she made this comment that this is a deep and probing analysis of Indian democracy. That's true. I had done a book, Talking Films, with a London-based journalist, Nasreen Munni Kabir, and it was a long conversation of almost 200 pages. But her very first question was, what is a good conversation? And I said, there are 3 levels of conversation. One, about people. Second, about incidents. And third, about ideas. That is the superior conversation. I think this book qualifies for that superior conversation. This is a book of ideas. He has not trapped himself into personalities or particular incidents. Yes, of course, there are some references, but that is not the main thrust. His thrust is about ideas, which are universal. And I must, in all honesty, confess that I have not read it from cover to cover, but I have read it a lot on different topics, and I stood educated at many points, and I was very happily confirmed about things that I think, and Rajeev wrote those things perhaps in a better language, so I was very happy. But after having said this, and congratulating Rajeev for writing this, which was necessary, now I'll show my dissent. That is chapter 4. My disagreement starts from the very title. Are religious and secular ideals. What is this, religious and secular ideas? You see, you give 2 entities, either they are on one side or they are totally opposite. Then you mention both of them. Is religiosity and secularism on one side? I'm afraid not. They are not. Although religions, I mean, I won't mind if you blame religions for weather change, but the fact is that religions have certain prejudices, but they remain benign as long as they are only religious. They become malignant when they are taken out and used for some other vested interests. That's a fact. I believe even the crusade or the so-called jihad in 13th century or 14th century was also not religious. There were other motives. There were imperialism behind it. They're conquering the territory, plunder, and so on. But that's not the topic at the moment, so let's come back. So if they are not totally opposite, if they are not on one side, what could be the title? Religion and traditional values, or secularism and liberal values, or religion and atheism. That is the opposite, not secularism. Or secularism and communalism. You have to differentiate I have no love lost. I'm an atheist. I have no love lost for religions. But I believe there is a difference between religion and communalism. One is meanness, another is stupidity. You can't put them together. So, in last 100 years, Indian subcontinent has taken the biggest hit on the secularism of this country with the partition of India, as he mentioned. That's right. Now, this is, we believe that this was a religious conflict. Was it so? Ironically, most of the religious education institutions of India were against the partition. Not only institutions, but a far right-wing, bigoted party like Jamaat-e-Islami was against the partition. And who were for it? The industrialists, some in Khoja, Bori industrialists, some Nawabs, some rich lawyers, led by a gentleman, westernized gentleman, who was known for his whiskey and pork. So that much religion, and that much it was a fight of two religions and two civilizations. But you need religion, because if there is any system which is ugly, any demand which is unreasonable, any administration, any structure, social structure which is exploitative, too demanding, too unjust, you have to give it a cover, because it's ugly. And in every situation, religion becomes the cover. Even this pork-eating and whiskey-drinking leader had a slogan, Pakistan ka matlab kya? La ilaha illallah. Perhaps that's all he knew about Islam. So, that is how it is. But we say, these are religious communities. Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and Christians. Yes, they are, of course. And they are based on religion. Yes, also true. So is Parsi Gymkhana in Bombay, Christian Gymkhana, Islam Gymkhana, Hindu Gymkhana. They were made for different communities who were the followers of different religions. But if we look into their activities, these activities have hardly anything to do with religion. They play, there are big tournaments, there are table tennis matches, they have cricket teams. So what it has to do with Parsi religion or Islam or Hinduism? Nothing. The same way, these communities, maybe they are identified with that religion, but their politics, their demands, their expectations, sometimes their fair demands, sometimes their unfair demands, are not rooted in religion. They pretend that. Now, the moment we put religiosity and secularism, we are making a mistake. We are giving dignity to communalism. We are accepting the mask as the face. It's a mask, it's not the face. And why people use this? People with very selfish motives, people with very narrow ideas, which are not liberal, which is not. What is liberal? Liberal means that everybody should participate in it, everybody should have a say. But they want to hoard power. They want to become all-powerful and controlling. Now, how do they do that? It's an ugly desire. They have to use religion's cover. And they know, not only cover, they know that the harpoon of religion is deeply stuck in the hearts of people. It's a harpoon. And you can pull the rope and people will come. That is how they bring them in for their agenda, which is not religious at all. Not religious. I mean, if a society, all over the world it is happening. You see, what happens that when a minority, and the so-called leaders of minority, want some unfair, indecent rights, like instant divorce. It's a machismo. It is the society where, I mean, you are not willing to give equal respect to women. How do you cover that? you cover it with religion. This demand, believe me, it cannot happen in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, most of the Muslim countries don't have this rule. Why are you asking? It's religion. So it means all those people who have banned this are out of religion. If it is religion, they have left Islam. No, it's a cover for power, the man's power. We confuse it with religion. And we give it dignity by that. Whatever is happening today is not religion. It is hunger for unquestioned power. And the moment we club secularism and religiosity, we fall in that trap. So I think in the second edition, I'm sure very soon you will have the second edition. Rajeev Saab, you must give a thought to this title. Thank you.
Thank you, Javed Saab. You ran a sharp scalpel, and there are proposed additions and additions. And I think now the time is right, and it's only appropriate that Professor Romila Thapar has the last word. So, Professor Thapar, it's over to you for your thoughts.
I hope it won't be the last word. Good evening, everybody. Sorry, what is that? Oh, it's Mac. Okay. One doesn't know these days. Let me begin by apologizing for being here. I had no intention of taking part in this discussion, but I was press-ganged by Rajeev, who absolutely insisted. And I must say that I am now very grateful to him for this press-ganging, because it forced me to read the book. And it's a pretty good read. Highly recommended. But let me just touch on a few things that came to my mind as I was reading. Reading Rajeev's book, I was struck by how accessible it is, by its thoughtfulness, and by its concern with the fundamental question, or at least which some of us think is a fundamental question these days in our society, the question of the relationship of ethics to our society. And in this you have everything coming in, politics and social rules, regulations, and everything. Anyway, or the lack thereof. There's that problem too. Do we have the ethics or do we not have the ethics? Such reflections, I think, are absolutely crucial in our times, given the problem of locating the ethic, if it is still around. Hence the need, I think, to recall it. And you must excuse me because I'm going to take a rather Brodelian, long-term, long-distance view and quote from the past. And you must forgive me for doing so. But the past comes to me very naturally, especially when I'm speaking about the present. Society has become infinitely more complicated in our time and more interdependent in many ways. And the spine of modernity, what we regard we're doing now, we're being modern, the spine of modernity is democracy. But democracy without ethics ceases to be democracy. It becomes autocracy. And this is why I am trying to introduce this idea, which Rajeev has done so successfully in the book, but I hope one does it more successfully in terms of convincing people of the centrality of ethics to a society. The year 1947 was not just a historical marker, which it was. It was a marker recording a dramatic and a traumatic change, both together. It marked a major shift in our history, establishing a new formation of governance. Its core was to be democratic functioning, unfamiliar to us from pre-colonial or colonial times. This was something brand new that we were going in for. But it had a little visibility, a small, tiny visibility, in the discussions that went on as part of the national movement, the anti-colonial movement. And so there is a linkage there. The earlier centralized kingdoms and feudal states, if you like, were to mutate into a democratic nation state after we became independent. And from being subjects, from being the praja, or the children of kings, we were to become free citizens in a nation state. And we were to establish all the rights of citizens as required by our constitution. And I couldn't agree more with what has been said about the centrality of the Constitution in this society that we're making today. And democracy, if it is to be effective, also requires, in addition, ethical governance. That is a must. In early times, clan societies took form gradually as kingdoms and centralized systems, and these systems changed to more feudalistic patterns or similar patterns of governance. The next change lay in the overthrowing of colonial rule and its being replaced by something totally different, a secular, democratic nation state. And please remember that what we were doing was not just automatically gliding from one thing into the next. We were doing something absolutely new, and therefore we should have had our antennae out, which unfortunately we didn't have. In the first decade, some sights were set towards freedom and equality in accordance with the Constitution. All citizens claimed equal rights without any historical or social differentiation. In theory, this was granted. This was contradicting, of course, the traditional texts, the Dharmashastras, the Hadith, and so on. They don't believe in the equality of everybody. They believe in the inequality, and therefore it's important to keep that in mind. The collective rights in the Constitution were also intended to ensure the material welfare of all citizens. And we often forget that. We're so busy talking about liberty, equality, and fraternity that we forget that the collective rights also mean food, water, education, health, social justice, and so on. That is extremely important. And the most important of these is, of course, the freedom in all spheres, religious, political, social. Now, India begins life as the child of democracy, and I'm very particular that it is not parental, it is a child. It is the child of democracy, and so too were all its other siblings. And by siblings, I mean all the other colonies that were given independence at this time, that moved from a colonial system to becoming, hoping to become, independent nation states. And they were all looking forward to being liberated from colonial control and born in freedom. So the well-being of the growing child of democracy lay in providing the rights of citizenship, and the ethics of governance should have been the model. What happened? Partition, in a sense, drew attention away from the rights of citizenship and focused on communalism. What we should have been celebrating and working towards was the creation of this democratic nation state, instead of which we were rightly or wrongly and very understandably upset by what had happened, and therefore communalism became a very important feature of our existence. that which should have ended with the coming of the nation state. Right, you've got your two nation states, you've got an Islamic state in Pakistan. That should have been the end of the story, of that story. But on the contrary, it was reinforced by religion-based nationalism. This nationalism that came up in the 20s and 30s, which was really drawing from religion. It was not anti-colonial. It was banging and attacking the other religion. It became a diversion. It became a diversion from the action of moving towards a secular democratic nation state. And questioning its feasibility for a secular democracy was not adequately argued. And this is where my generation, I'm afraid, failed. We should have been much more conscious of the need to argue this. And if we are to quote antecedents from the past, then the freedom and necessity of arguments, what Rajeev calls conversations, discussions, debates, go back many centuries to the time of the Buddha, even earlier. Cities in those days had parks for such forceful debates and considerations amongst citizens, and they were very appropriately called the Kotuhalashala, the place where you raise curiosity and you ask questions, awkward questions, and you have discussions. And I often think that maybe we should go back to revising that, having Kotuhalashalas, not just one in one city, but all over, which is why I'm in full agreement with what was said earlier about the need for samvad, the need for argument, the need for discussion. But there's one difference. The Kotuhalashala is not dependent on some organization getting together and putting up a big banner and saying, come and discuss this in the precincts of this, this, and this. These are natural occasions where people gather in parks and crossroads and talk. I mean, we don't have pubs, but if we had pubs, then the pubs would be our Kotuhalashalas. But I think it is very, very important as part of civic life to have places where people can just gather and gas and talk to each other and maybe learn something, maybe not learn something, but get it out of the system. Talk about what's worrying them and disturbing them and what needs to be done. And such spaces, of course, were very characteristic of early cultures. And so there's something to be said about taking early cultures a little more seriously and perhaps looking at how they organized civic life. The Greeks in Athens, for example, had what they called the groves of academy. And we all know that people like Plato and Socrates spent many hours in the groves of academy discussing their ideas and formulating them. Socrates, alas, had to drink poison because he did not believe in the gods that were being promoted by those in power in Athens, and therefore had to be silenced. But it's not necessarily that every Kotuhalashala should end up with people being silenced. In fact, the purpose is to get them to talk. So that's where you discuss things like the rights of citizens and the equality of citizens and all these very basic issues which we are vague about. I mean, how many of us have even read the Constitution that we swear by and keep on saying we must have the Constitution? Anyway, I would like to highlight one significant argument from Rajeev's book that I thought was particularly pertinent to our times, the subject of ethics and its relationship to politics and governance. That is really absolutely essential that we give thought to this. Why has democracy not become the established norm in the last 75 years? Time enough for there to be some roots somewhere. We seem to be unclear on the subject of ethics and governance. For instance, in the very first decade, we had adult franchise. This was Nehru's great achievement, and democratic representation through regular elections. What do we have today? We have defections. They have a bearing on the elections. They're not unconnected with elections, but they are defections. And the question that we have to ask is, are defections compatible with the implicit ethics of a democratic society and system? If they are not, please let's get together in a Kautuhalshala and discuss this issue and understand why we think that they are not and why they seem to be acceptable. In place after place you have this happening without too much of a fuss being made. People sort of seem to think, theek hai, wo election ho rahi hai, to defection bhi saath mein chal rahi hai. But this is something that one has to really... and the same question can be put to majoritarian politics, that the majoritarian politics that annul the idea of equality of all citizens. Democracy surely is something more than just a numbers game. And this is where, again, discussion is important. Speaking of ethics in governance, and please forgive me, I'm going back to one of my favorite topics. Speaking of ethics in governance, one ruler who raised this issue centuries ago was, of course, Ashok Maurya. He gave it much attention, and to which, in fact, Rajeev has referred fairly frequently, as has been mentioned, and I was delighted to see those references. Ashoka is about the only ruler who left us a large body of his own thought on this subject, particularly of ethics. And the much-quoted comment of H.G. Wells that he was a unique ruler amongst world rulers was occasioned largely by the king's declaration that the Dhamma, this is his interpretation of the Dhamma, do not confuse it with the Buddhist Dhamma or the Brahmanical Dharma. This is an Ashokan concept which he discusses in his edicts. I tried my best to explain that there is a difference between his Dhamma and the Buddhist Dhamma and the Brahmanical Dharma. But it is that being essential to civil life which is really extremely important. He informs us that 8 years after he began to rule, he fought a fierce campaign in Kalinga. The aftermath of this left him in deep remorse. He saw the severe disturbance that it had caused and the violent killing of many thousands of people. But curiously, he did not do much about it initially. And I've often wondered why it took him a little over 2 years, more than 2 years, to begin to think seriously about these problems. And if it was such a traumatic experience, he should have thought about it immediately. It was only a few years later that he spoke of recognizing that the ethic of good governance lay in ensuring the well-being of people over whom he ruled. And after his 12th year, he became even more active in this matter and expounded on it much more fully towards the end of his reign in his 27th year. The acts, intentions, aspirations that suffused his thought were what he referred to as Dhamma. He spoke separately of Buddhism to the Sangha, but his understanding of what he called Dhamma as an ethic for society was in a different voice. And that's the important point, to recognize that different voice. He made a distinction between the ethics of the teachings of a particular sect, as applied to its followers, and the ethics of the more extensive kind, applicable to all his subjects, irrespective of whose teachings they were following. And the public is enjoined to observe the ethic, to accept that all the diverse teachings of the time should be respected. Concord, he writes, is to be commended so that men may hear each other's principles. This is an important point. His solution does not lie in lynching, beating, burning, slaughtering those who are even suspected of having other kinds of different beliefs. And above all else, the unique thrust in his practice of governance, what he comes to gradually in time, but eventually reaches there and becomes a great proponent of it, is the ethical preeminence and practice of non-violence, ahimsa. This for him was the crowning practice, but he comes to it gradually. He doesn't rush into it. Apart from respecting elders, parents, teachers, and many other laudable activities as part of the ethic, there is also the more all-pervading ethic. All his subjects must be aware of the need for their well-being, as also the responsibility of those ruling to fulfill this need. Categories of his officials, the yuktas, the rajokas, the pradeshikas, and so on, were to do public readings of his edicts, where he explains what he means by the ethics of governance. And they were to make tours across their administrative domain and familiarize people with this teaching and this ethic. This is not conversion to Buddhism. This is something much, much bigger and concerns the whole of society. How you live well, you govern well, what are your rights and demands, what do you expect, and how can it be fulfilled? And then the officers have to report their findings back to the king. And through this activity, they are inculcating the ethic of virtuous behavior on the part of everyone, including the rulers and the ruled. It's not just one category of people that have to have ethical behavior, but all. Ashoka did not succeed, of course. He left us a legacy of the idea, which I think is terribly important, to be followed, to be discussed, maybe to be continued if possible. And he told us what we could aspire to, which is equally important. Let me end then with a question that I've been asking myself and I have no answer to. That when we hold up model heroes from history, why do we always give so much space to the largely battle-scarred, violent conquerors? Why is Ashoka not mentioned as being different? And what is the difference? And this is why I was so thrilled with Rajeev's discussion of him. And the question I keep asking is that can it be that because he called for the linking of governance with ethics, people are quiet about him? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Thapar, for that. We have a couple of minutes for questions, so as we have a very illustrious audience as well. Are there any thoughts? Questions?
Would you like to respond?
You should after the questions, or do you want to do response first? If there are no questions, there are just a couple here. You respond to everything. Ji, is there a microphone somewhere?
Thank you. Well, actually, it's to address to Javed Akhtar Saab.
Could you identify yourself, sir?
Yogendra Kumar.
Thanks.
You talked about religion and secularism, but the people who also at that time wanted the partition of India were the communists. So if you remember, after 47, after independence, there was a violent communist uprising in Telangana, which was suppressed. And many of the communists actually went to Pakistan, because the communist thesis actually was that the partition actually meant a kind of turmoil in the society in South Asia, which created the right environment, a revolutionary environment for the creation of a communist system in both India and Pakistan. Faiz Ahmad Faiz Sahab actually was one of the votaries of that. Thank you.
Yeah, any questions, please? If you could.
I actually feel that I should respond first.
You certainly should. Go ahead.
And then
Yes,
we can open it
yeah.
to others. Because otherwise I'll,
Yeah, you lose
so the first thing I want to say is, some general points following what everybody said, and a couple of on these major disagreements or things that I missed out. And I'll try to be very brief because I really want to hear other questions as well. First is that I have, in my second brief chapter, I say that a nation is a people in conversation. For me, therefore, anybody who is a perpetrator of violence against this conversation among the people, or anybody who disrupts this conversation, is really and doing anti-national activity. So I couldn't agree more with what Sudheendra ji said, that with some people, and I don't want to name any one particular group, some people you have to sangharsh, ek tarah sangharsh hona padega, violence or disruption ke khilaf. It would be nice if we can bring them to the table for conversation, but there will be a lot of struggle. And with those who are ready for this, for conversation without disruption and violence, I mean, we should have, very happily have a dialogue with them. And that for me is nation building. The good of the nation has to be evolved. We have to agree on what that common good is. The Constitution provides a good sort of morality within which this conversation is to take place. And it is, after all, a document that accepts that as far as different views of the good life is concerned, as far as the different conceptions of what it is for us is ultimate self-fulfillment, there is a huge acceptance of pluralism, which is very much a part of our tradition. And a Constitution is actually committed to preserving it. So that's one point. The second is about ethics. When we think of changing our society, there are, of course, two ways of doing it. One, and this is linked to the point about conversation. When we think of changing our society, we can either do it by force, by violence, which in my very limited experience and from my reading doesn't really work. Or we can do it by persuasion. But this persuasion has to presuppose some sense of what is good, what is bad, what is better, what is worse. There's no way that you can't intend some, there are unintentional changes that occur. But when you're trying to intend some change, you have to have some orientation. There's no way that we can change anything without some ethical orientation, right? And that's why having a clarity on what that good is towards which we change for the better. After all, we are looking for transformation. That's what the Constitution was all about. We had this anti-colonial struggle. We had a vision of why we must wrest power from the British imperialists, that it's not good enough to be ruled by them. We have to rule ourselves. And we then turned towards what it is that we must create. Now, we had a pretty solid ethical vision. And we also had some rules within which this is to take place, without disregarding other groups who are different from us, without doing violence to them. But there are some rights that we have, right? And so on. So no social change between these two alternatives of change with an ethical orientation and a change which is imposed from above by violence, I'm pretty clear. We have to take the ethical direction, and that is why centrality of ethics. Everybody has accepted that, but I thought I'd just sort of point this out.
knowing full well that it's not always easy to do it. There are, we must, there are enough of us who have lived through this, and there are enough realists sitting in this in this audience and in the world, and who keep telling us that, power, wealth, these are the things that determine. And one has to, can't disregard that. But yet, if we want to really make a change, it has to come not by power and by wealth, but from another, an understanding of the good and the bad and the right and the wrong. The two things, that we were, I think Sudheendra pointed out, socialism, I think for me, socialism is a world where human beings, social creatures, live in an unalienated manner. Both not alienated from the world at large, but also unalienated beings, in a fraternal relationship. That is what socialism is. A deep sociability, and I've talked about it. I did economics when I was a student in college, but I've lost confidence in my ability to understand economics or to write about it, and therefore I didn't write about socialist economics. But as far as socialist life is concerned, without having to mention it time and again that this is socialism, I think I've talked a great deal about socialism in this book. On partition, yes, the word partition may have been mentioned once and twice, but I honestly believe that in several of the essays, and I point to the new form of ideological violence, or the pernicious idea of exclusive belonging, and several the politics of enmity that you mentioned, all of these are related to what happened in 1947 and which continues even today. So while in my own way I never really talk directly about things, this is my weakness or my strength. I have nobody to judge, but it's been on my mind all the time. There's also a chapter on justice, something on forgetting and remembering and forgiveness. There are 2 chapters on that, and you mentioned this common folk wisdom, where I talk about a Pakistani driver who was so good to us when we were in Australia. So I've mentioned it, but there are no separate chapter. On religion, and I think on religion and on secularism, this isn't a conversation, but it's still a conversation going on between Javed Sahab and me for the last 30 years, is it? And we've never agreed on it. I have a very different conception of religion. We have been, the religion has 2 components. One is what I call ethics, the ethics of ultimate self-fulfillment. And I include in that any kind of a vision and a path to that vision with help from one another and with the help of a teacher, which is extremely important. That loose ethical community is one idea of religion, where you dig deeper and go higher. And this doesn't have to depend on one God. It doesn't, although a lot of people believe that this is something that can be achieved only with the help of a framework or one God. There is another framework which believes in many gods and goddesses, which is, we know that this exists. And the third is without the help of any God. And I'm really, frankly, not really interested in the debate between these 3. This is a scientific debate, whether this exists or that doesn't exist, and literally and in the human affairs, one shouldn't model anything on the natural sciences. I don't think there is a good answer to that question. Some questions don't really have a good answer. There are some questions where we have to agree that there are no answers or no good answers. As far as I know, there are no good answers. And for me, the better issue for me is whether when you believe in God, or gods and goddesses, or when you have a framework which is completely independent of God, what is the ethics? Does it make you a better person, or does it make you a bad person? Does it make you moral? Does it make you concerned about others, or does it make you completely indifferent to others? So that is the fundamental question for me. Not we have a very strong atheistic tradition. Many of you sitting, and Romila is here. They would know. I mean, Sankhya, Mimamsa, early Buddhism, early Jainism, and I'm told by my scholar friends who worked on the entire first century, first millennia after the Common Era, we had a very strong, practically every philosopher was an atheist. They didn't believe in God. But there are, human beings have three cultural capacities. One capacity is mimetic, the other is mythic, and the third is theoretic. And I do not, of grasping the world, of understanding the world. And one is not going to supersede the other. One will live with the other. Religion is far more dependent on the mimetic and the mythic. Science is, of course, more theoretic, but no scientist actually can understand the world without mimetic and mythic elements. If you look at the process of scientific, even the great Karl Popper, when he didn't believe that there was a logic of discovery, he just believed that there was a logic of validation and justification. But there's no logic in discovery and logic of discovery. So, I have a very different view on this, and I don't want to get into these debates. And Javed is constantly drawing me into that debate, and I'm constantly telling him कि इसको छोड़ देते हैं. He has his view, and I have my view on this. So I better stop.
Okay. So Rajeev says there's sometimes not good answers, but I hope we get a couple of good questions in. Maybe a couple.
Thank you, Rajeev. Most distinguished panel one. My question is really about the role of emerging technologies in making democracy more responsive. If we, the people, have to survive as a system of value, or a system or a value, the despair of being wrongly represented must transform into hope for finding ways to participate in governance. New technologies can be about both access and control. And I'm not talking about Kotuhul Shalas and WhatsApp, but seriously where we are going in terms of technologies. Whether that finds a way into the book, and I will, of course, soon find out.
Okay, can we take a couple more and then we'll just... Yes, sir.
Unless we're able to put love and affection, like Dalai Lama and others do it all the time, I don't see how you can discuss ethics and values.
Impossible to discuss ethics and values. Money, let's try here. We'll take one more and then
while I completely agree with Sudheendra Kulkarni that Samvad is the essence of civic living, what do we do when Samvad does not lead to Samanvay? We had the example this evening of Romila telling us about Ashoka. But if you look at the intellectual origins of the current political establishment, for Savarkar, the biggest villain, the person who had the least ethics, was none other than the Ashoka whom Romila was talking about. So how do you reconcile, on the one hand, Ashoka as a villain with Ashoka as the ultimate example of ethics and governance? It is this dilemma that I think has not been resolved by the discussion that we have had today. Thank you.
One more question.
My question is to Professor Thapar.
Somebody's hijacked the mic. Please, no, go on.
As a historian, you have known about the autocratic rule and learned about the ruins of democracy. So does your concern with degeneration of the political nature of today comes from a balance between a historian and a person of the age? And how does this balance affect anyone's search for academic truthfulness, because it will forever seek to see history with an intention of preserving any sort of...
Yes, ma'am. Here, please. That's the last question. Yeah.
Yeah.
As a historian, as a person.
It has been quite a privilege to be, in the audience of such an esteemed panel. I have not read the book. I just showed up for different reasons, and it's been a delight. But I have the impression I'm getting, and I haven't read the book, so it may be very unfair in my assessment, is firstly, one of you used the phrase, we need to celebrate diversity, and you may not have written about it. But I find the word diversity very problematic, because it's diverse from whom? Because I rarely see Muslims and Christians celebrating diversity. It's usually somebody in power who's talking about it. So there's a little bit of a hierarchy there. Also, it seems that your framework of analysis is coming more, and it's according to the speakers, from Ashoka to Buddha, etc., as philosophers and dialoguing, etc. And I'm wondering if in the long history of India there have ever been any non-Hindu philosophers that could be used as a framework for analysis. I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing, I want to use the word critiquing, but there's a generality in the discussion we had today which seemed to skirt around the real issues. And of course, ethics is very important, but if we don't pin down the real issues and use names and and religions, instead of saying religion and secularism, it really at some level, as Mr. Javed Akhtar says, doesn't mean anything. How many secularisms are there? There are different forms of secularism. So we need to start saying things like Hindus and Muslims, and we need to create a framework that's really relevant to today's crisis. And I didn't get that sense from the discussion that, maybe it's a philosophical book, but for me, the reality of what exists today is much deeper. And the question to me is, who decides that I am diverse? Because I don't know from whom I am diverse. And the second question is, who gets to have the dialogues? Yes, we need dialogues, but who gets to do that? Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay, so can we just go back to panelists for like very brief minute and a half responses to what we've heard? Whoever wants to have a go first.